Good afternoon. We can start the last section. And it's quite important section, is a sort of challenge for this country, access to the space. So with the newly established Australian Space Agency and hundreds of startups entering an Australian market, how we can ensure the benefit of the space are made available to everyone, everywhere. Access to the space from Australia can facilitate growth of the space economy, and we agree on this. So to develop this discussion, I would like to invite to the floor Richard Price, is the facilitator, the Chief Executive of South Australian Space Industry Centre and Defence SA. Dr. Lloyd, the Chief Executive Officer of Southern Launch. Carley Scott, Chief Executive Officer, Equatorial Launch Australia. Adam Gilmour, Chief Executive Officer of Gilmore Space. And Nikolic, Chief Executive Officer of Black Sky Aerospace. Please.
All right. So we've got an hour and 20 minutes ahead of us, and it's going to be a very exciting hour and 20 minutes because these are real rocket scientists. You haven't had any rocket scientists till today, but now we've got real rocket scientists. Please send in questions using Slido. The more controversial, the better, because this is the last segment of the day, and a few may be getting a bit weary. You know, we'll get a really great conversation going. So I thought we'd start, get everybody opportunity to introduce their businesses, where they see their businesses going, and also perhaps a bit about themselves and actually why they're passionate about what they do. So we'll start with Carley, I think.
Thanks very much, Richard. So I'm Carley Scott, CEO of Equatorial Launch Australia. We are developing a commercial spaceport in the Northern Territory, and actually we have just started our land clearing and our team's on site looking at that this week. So it's a very exciting time for launch in Australia, with a lot happening right around the country. Things that inspire me about getting into space, I think that I'm a good story for new space and the opportunities for everyone to be involved in space, because unlike most stories, I didn't grow up with people around me in space or looking at the stars and dreaming and saying, that's what I'm going to do. But I did see the opportunity to be involved in international trade, technologies, something that really makes a huge long-term difference to the community in Australia and abroad. And that is something that I've found hugely inspiring, and space has a unique opportunity to give people a chance to contribute in that way.
Thanks, Carley. So I'm Adam Gilmore. I'm the CEO of Gilmore Space Technologies. I've always been a fan of space. First 20 years of my career I was a banker, but I've always been following what's going on in the space industry. I think a really pivotal event was in 2004 when Scale Composites won the X Prize, and then Paul Allen invested $21 million into that venture. And then Richard Branson came in a week later and said, okay, I'm going to license that technology to form Virgin Galactic. And a week later, the Middle East, the Saudi Arabians invested $300 million for a 30% stake. So the company was valued at $1 billion like that. So when I was a banker, I was thinking, okay, that is a good deal. So since then, I've been studying the industry and figuring out what is a good thing to do. And I've started Gilmore Space Technologies in 2014. We have 50 people in the company now. We've raised 2 rounds of venture capital money. We're developing an orbital vehicle that can take 210 kilograms to a 500-kilometer sun-synchronous orbit. That's our first vehicle. We're also planning a heavy vehicle that will take between 1,500 to 2,000 kilograms to the same orbit. And we have very long-term plans by around 10 to 12 years, we'd love it, to develop a vehicle that can take people to space. And I think that's probably our ultimate goal, is to take people to space. Our catch cry of our business is all orbits, all planets, so we want to be able to go out and help humanity explore not just the moon and Mars, but everything else in the solar system. Our rocket's called Eris. Eris is a moon that's even beyond the orbit of Pluto, so it's a very far away destination, and one day I'd like to send a probe that way. You got one?
I'm all good. Thanks, Adam. I'm Blake Nikolic, the CEO of Black Sky Aerospace, as the board said. I've been involved in aerospace and that for a long, long time, but a little bit of history is I previously was very heavily involved in IT and explosives, primarily fireworks. Now, people don't think there's a lot of synergy there, but there actually is a lot. We did a lot of choreography of fireworks when you see some of the big shows. Ran away from all of that and joined the Army as a pilot, so in aviation, and a culmination of those things and a father who was a math science teacher for 37 years. We did all the cool experiments at home, of course. Led me to basically aerospace in rockets in this sense. So Black Sky Aerospace, we are still a small startup, about 2 years old. I have another company, Australian Rocketry, that focuses on a lot of the importation and supply of amateur rockets and some of the lower end commercial products. But Black Sky is focusing on, we have 4 core streams: solid rocket propulsion, suborbital sounding rockets, which is what is probably our most active, or is our most active component at the moment. We have an orbital program, but that is some time away as we develop and mature other materials and then everything else. Exciting for us, in 2018, we did launch the first commercial payloads in Australia on a suborbital rocket, and that was a capability demonstrator and also a good kickstart to prove that the industry is real. So we had a lot of delegates there from the Space Agency, CSIRO, Primes, Defence, the whole lot. Looking forward to doing lots of launches. We have a launch site in Queensland that we use for our suborbital, but looking forward to extending those out to sites in Northern Territory and South Australia. Big cheer for SA while we're down here, I guess. But yeah, basically Black Sky Aerospace is developing and helping other companies mature their technology as well. So offering payloads to launch for space qualification, medical research, a whole range of things in defence aspects as well. And through those technologies, working with other companies and like Gilmore's to help basically create capability for the country and see Australia really shine in the space race over the next many years.
Thanks, Blake. Thanks to SASIC for making me a doctor. The doctor is my dad and my wife. I'm just a lowly rocket scientist, so thank you. So I'm Lloyd, the CEO of Southern Launch. My background, I fell in love with launching rockets back when I used to work for Defence Research. And there is nothing more exciting than seeing a very big rocket launch and take experimental payloads up into the atmosphere and doing a whole bunch of research. And it's from that foundation that we in Southern Launch have created 3 core capabilities. The first one is around safety and understanding both the range safety and the flight safety component of rocket launches. That then underpins our ability, our orbital launch facility, which is down in Whalers Way, which is about 40 kilometers from us here in Adelaide, 40 minutes flight. It's a little bit further than 40 kilometers away. And that's all around polar and sun synchronous orbits. We have about 3,500 kilometers of open ocean to allow launch vehicles to get into space. And last week we announced our Kaniba test range, which is a test range out near Ceduna, also in South Australia. And that is about 40 kilometers from Ceduna. And that allows companies to go out and de-risk both flight vehicles and satellite components before you go and do the real thing, put some satellites into orbit. So together, what that means is that we've been watching how the Australian space industry has matured, and it has gone from looking at market research to justify the existence of the industry to now looking at contracts to operate launch sites to build launch vehicles. And from Southern Launch's perspective, we've got Perigee Aerospace, and today who are using Whalers Way, and today we signed an agreement with Duke Systems to use Caniba, and that's a real demonstration that the industry is maturing and moving forward. So it's really exciting to see what's happening here, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the jobs and the inspiration that comes from access to space. And looking forward to it all. Thank you.
So let's start by teasing out, well, what's the market like? You know, why Australia when there are launch sites already all over the world? We've got new mega rockets coming in, launching constellations of satellites at a time. What is it that means that Australia can be successful in this market?
I think before we get into the stats and figures around the world, one of the things to note about why Australia should get into launch is, we just mentioned it, launch is incredibly inspiring, and the flow-on impacts of undertaking a launch or a series of launches from your nation are really phenomenal. Now, we've modelled those out as launch sites as we tell our story, and we'll get into some of those figures in a second. But at that overarching concept, we all know that there are so many flow-on impacts from space. Launch really ignites the imagination and also helps to get the political will behind the series of industries that can really thrive through the space industry itself. Now, if we look at that concept to say, Australia is actually an excellent place for launch, but also for investment more broadly. And launch in itself is a critical enabler of future growth economically in Australia. Let's make that practical for a second. In East Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, where our launch site is, that's the top right-hand tip, about 600 k's east of Darwin. It's a mining town, and a mining town facing transition. So they are no longer refining bauxite into aluminium, and they're going to close that bauxite mine down. And when you talk to the community about the launch site that is being developed there and the practical activities that they can engage in along that process, it really gives people a spark of hope in that specific community about what they can be, what their community can be going forward. And that applies far more broadly than just in East Arnhem Land. To bring that into a macro sense as well about why is Australia good for launch, you can look at some of the mega trends that have been identified internationally that we're looking at. Now, on the panel, we've got people that are talking about propulsion. This is one of the mega trends or meta trends that have been identified internationally for space, and it's something that we're fostering here in our nation. We talk about resource utilisation. Now, Equatorial Launch Australia has signed a letter of intent with an Indigenous mining group. We've had Rio Tinto out on the site. There are real opportunities for us in the resources component to extend our knowledge and to do that through launch and native launch. We talk also about the benefits around research and technology and bringing all of our scientists along on that journey. We as a nation are exceptionally well placed internationally, not just because we have geographically great positions for launch, but also because we're a strong trading nation with great skills in the nation. We're a very stable nation as well. And that puts us at the top of the tree for launch specifically and to be that inspiring piece. We'd also look to some of those international trends to say, well, general compound annual growth rate for industries. Let's look at industries more broadly, maybe at 6.1% for the world itself. You go to some of the developing nations, the new industrialised economies, and that might be at about 7%, 7.5% for that growth as well. Come back home to Australia and what's happening here. Over a 20 plus year period, maybe 30 years, we've been sitting solidly at about 3.2%. We're dropping into the 2% now for compound annual growth rate as a measure of our economy and how we're doing and how good we are for investment and growth. The fact of the matter is we are looking to diversify our industries, we're looking for future industries, and we're looking to make use of the skills and baseline that we have in Australia to go forward. There is nothing like space that can make use of those sorts of industries and really diversify and give that opportunity for growth. When you look at launch specifically, 6% annual compound annual growth rate as an opportunity is one of the reports we've seen. It's a high level of growth that's seen for Australia's space sector and for launch specifically, that can form as a platform of inspiration but also practical growth for the nation. There are a couple of extra things I'll touch on before I hand the mic over. When you say, why launch? Can we do it? Absolutely we can. Why do it? You know, responsive space, closing that gap in the value chain to make sure that the people who are manufacturing satellites, using that data, have a direct link and opportunity to get to space from our own nation. Absolutely. Using our own vehicles to do that, our own launch sites to do that, is a tremendous opportunity that makes practical sense, but also is that spark of inspiration. So when you say why launch, can we do it? We've got the skills, we've got the resources, we've got the locations, and we've got the industry that's already pushing hard. Absolutely.
And to add to that, I'd say that there's three key reasons why you do launch. The first one is jobs right now. For every launch vehicle manufacturer that either is in Australia or who comes to Australia, you're looking at between 200 to 400 high-skilled direct jobs. And over a 10-year period, you're looking at about $1 billion worth of investment just due to each vehicle. Carley spoke really well about inspiring the future generation of jobs as well. And then the last reason I would say I'd put forward is national pride. You know, we Australia have launched 2 satellites to date. 1967 was RESAT, 1971 was Prospero, fantastic. New Zealand has launched 42 satellites over the last couple of years. So it's time for us to jump on board, I think.
Well, I think you've just nailed it. Outdone by New Zealand. That's only allowable in rugby, nothing else.
We currently have a customer out from the UK, and that is to do a sounding rocket campaign, and we were meant to launch last week, but between the 1st and 13th of February, we've had 486 mils of rain, so it's a tad wet. Now, this totally destroys what I'm about to say, which is one of the reasons for our launch site out west is also for economic growth out there. They're a drought-restricted area that got a lot of rain last week. But in general, they're looking to diversify as well. Farmers out there are struggling, whether it's crop or animals, and it's really terrible to see, you know, how a lot of things are unfolding out there. So bringing other industries like this and into regional areas, because generally we need lots of open space, or sea areas which are also unoccupied, it brings new economic growth into those areas. For the UK customer, the reason why they've come here, they're looking for large land mass. They don't have that over in Europe, and they also have very congested air traffic. So fortunately down here, some of the reasons with the sounding rockets, and Carley might be able to touch on this a bit more with NASA stuff, there's a big push to launch in the southern hemisphere. Not sure if you know this, but you can't see all the stars down here up the north. But they are big drives to have launches down in the south. Now to do that, you need geopolitically stable country. There's a few of those, and you need a large land mass, because typically speaking, if you're doing return to Earth services, you want to recover the payload. So seaward is not always the ideal option. So landing on big mass of land, there's only one country that can do that, and yeah, it's us. So there's a number of reasons why it's also critical that we have these opportunities to do it in Australia, because it's a massive economy that we can have just by the resources that we're blessed with.
So what I'm hearing is that you've got customers out there circling around. What is it that you need to happen in order to unlock those customers?
Money. I think, we've got a pipeline of about 32 launches from about 12 different customers, and 11 of them are foreign. So we started the company always thinking that we were launching foreign customers, and we think that's going to continue. But, you know, there's not a lot of infrastructure. You know, if we look at our competitors, they're generally launching from launch sites that have been funded by their own federal governments. So instead of these guys having to fork out all the money, the federal government has done that. I mean, America is the most extreme example of that. Even state governments spend lots and lots of money. The Mojave spaceport was invested about $230 million from the state government. You know, so it's totally different mindset. So I think that's one of the things that would be very, very helpful in terms of infrastructure. And then, you know, from our point of view, contracts. You know, the Australian government has a kind of, doesn't have a buyer system in Australia where they have to buy Australian. If we can't compete for US government launches because in America they have to use an American launcher to launch a US government payload. We don't have that here, so that would really help. Doesn't even have to change the product the government gets, but it changes the buying behavior. So those are some of the things that would make a big difference.
So what about, how can we then, so there's a direct investment model in launch facilities, there's a kind of a Australian industry capability type policy that we could use to encourage. What else can, you know, what are the barriers that you face in your day-to-day life?
So one of the key ones for us, and I think this is shared across the entire panel, is the intergovernment agreements that would allow both the transfer of componentry, be it satellite or rocket or infrastructure, requiring so that we can do safe launches and do timely launches. And you know, the space agency has been very good in starting that whole process and engaging with a large number of countries out there. And it's as the industry matures, so the requirements of those agreements will start to evolve and be tested. So it's I think that's for us one of the next steps that we'll be looking forward to. I'm just giving it to you.
So there's intergovernmental government agreements. You guys have probably looked around the world and you've seen what others have done. You've looked at how that model. You know, when it comes to this regulatory environment, this red tape issue around launch, what can we learn from others? What should we do? And maybe what shouldn't we do when you've actually looked at the best practice around the world?
Okay, so we've investigated launching from the United States and we've talked to the FAA. I think you've talked to the FAA as well. You know, the reality is, you know, rockets are reasonably dangerous. You know, if they go wrong, you know, they can crash and bad things can happen. So you have to have a very big duty of care when you're operating it. I mean, you know, rockets are big things. They go really, really fast. They're full of fuel. So I think it's inevitable that you'll have a degree of red tape. And what's important is one of the big lessons from the American system that they're trying to change is if you approve a rocket launch, so one of our rockets, if we launch from your site and then we want to launch from your site, that should not be a really big change. And if we make a small adjustment to our launch vehicle, that shouldn't be a big deal as well. So in America, each one of those things has had to be a totally new approval. So for example, SpaceX, every time they change their vehicle, they've had to go back to the FAA and get another launch approval, which takes a long time. So we could learn from that and say, okay, if we're not making major changes, let's not make a whole new process and let's just put an addendum on it, and that will save a lot of time and a lot of headcount.
The other one is timeliness. So I know for Carley and I, our competitors are other governments, right? So they have a lot more money than ELA and Southern Launch has put together. So for us, we need to be out there to capture the market opportunity as it presents itself, which is right now. So it's not really about what the content of for us, what so much the content of the approval process is, and we agree with Adam that it is what it is because it has to be what it is. It's about the timeliness so that Australia as a whole can do safe launch from our lands, as well as reap the financial benefit that we as all Australians would like to see, the jobs and the growth coming to our country.
And much to Adam's point about rockets are fast, they're dangerous and that, the reason we have risk templates and risk profiles is not for when they work. No one actually cares for when it works on the regulatory side of things. It's when things go wrong, and the appetite for risk probably needs to evolve and change, so that we create these risk templates on the basis that something is going to go wrong. And if it does go wrong, well, that's horrible for us as the provider, but nothing actually bad happens because it lands in the area where it's meant to land. Clean it up, move on, and away you go. So I think one of the things that we need to be cautious of is not trying to over-regulate things with risk and the likes, because at the end of the day, yes, it is a dangerous game. And for the nature of at least the early stage, there's not human flight involved, so there's no direct human interaction with the vehicles. We'd be decades away if we're trying to do that from Australia. But the risk that is involved is managed accordingly. So it's not actually a risk to persons and property in that. It's just for our own vehicles and sites.
Yeah, I think some of the things as a takeaway here, the fact is that there are customers that are coming to the launch sites in Australia, to the rocket providers, and saying, we want to launch from Australia. And that's a really exciting thing. So now it's about saying, how does Australia do that really, really well? So we're a priority choice, not just because there's an oversupply of payload, really, is what we're looking at, but because we've got such an efficient system that we're able to make that whole process really effective as an industry. Now, we're all saying that regulation is important and appropriate risk management and action is very important. We all agree to that. But we can see for ourselves two really practical examples that are things that can be adjusted right now. Now, if you look at the environmental regulations specifically, at the moment we needed to apply ourselves and our practice and align it to what the mining industry does. Now, not only is that a very heavy process, but it also isn't fit for purpose. So we were comparing rocket emissions and the impact that that would have against a scale that's applied to a solid smokestack, a constant emission. So if you're looking at saying you've got a solid smokestack, a constant emission of anything that someone's sitting under and working, 5 days a week for their whole life, what should they be exposed to? Now that level will be dramatically different to the exposure that might drift past in a split instant on a site, and probably in an area where there's no one actually standing. So in that regard, there's an opportunity for our regulation system to evolve with the space industry and see that we start having leading international practice that is actually fit for purpose for rocket launch specifically. When you look then also at that risk mitigation discussion that we're having there, I think the point that Adam raised is really, really important. If we have a vehicle come to our site and we know that last week it was the same vehicle, same fuel, payload, all the rest of it, and it's going to the same spot, it shouldn't be that you start that whole process and have to do every calculation again, have that independent review of that calculation again, and paying for that 2, 3, 4 times over every single time you launch. It is potentially something that is a little bit too onerous, a bit too costly, both in cash and time, and may not actually improve the risk mitigation or safety of what you're doing. So I think when we have those discussions with regulators, Australia will come along really quickly in leaps and bounds in launch and in space.
With the regulation side as well, I think very important is education. And there's an education on multi-levels here. One, between the regulators. So each regulator knows what each other's role is and how that relates. But also from the inspiration side of thing. As kids come up, like we're seeing lots of startups forming, and it's fantastic. It's really exciting to see all these startups, and this is whether it's in propulsion, in rockets, in satellites, whatever it might be. But there's often a lack of education or understanding of what's the requirements, what do I need to do, who do I need to address. So we're talking a lot about the ASA having the space launch licenses and CASA or explosive regulators. But you've got other departments like ACMA, Australian Communication Media Authority, who handle all of the comms, whether it's a TV signal or a signal from a satellite. There's licensing requirements and things like that, and a lot of people aren't aware of what those requirements are. So it's an educational side as well, that because we're in our infancy, because we're trying to inspire people, get it into the ground level, whether it's through primary school, high school, universities, And it's an opportunity to educate people so that as they're coming through and graduates are coming through and startups are forming, they're already aware of what the requirements are. So it's really ideal to be able to have their knowledge at a base where, you know, they didn't have to study to learn it. It's just ingrained in them as they come through.
Thank you. So I think the takeaway that I'm hearing from this really is, because we are starting afresh, or maybe we're not in concrete anyway, we have a real opportunity to get inside the time loop and make things really quick and agile, and we have the opportunity to ensure that we're not doing mindless repeat work when we're getting approvals. We actually set up a sort of a pattern system where you actually you have a actually use a risk-based analysis of you analyze a change, and then you say, what's the risk of that change, therefore do I need to recertify or not? So I think that's a great opportunity for us. But therefore, where does space tourism fit? Because, you know, as we've said, we're not going to launch people, at least in the next few years. But if a space tourist operator comes in, what would that do to this environment? Because all of a sudden you're bringing people into the equation. Is it worth it? Should we be doing space tourism?
Well, Virgin Galactic listed on the stock market at $10 a share a few months ago. The stock immediately cratered to about $7, but now it's $30. So, you know, the US stock market kind of thinks space tourism is profitable or good. The US regulators have taken a pretty hands-off approach to space tourism, almost like a buyer beware. So the level of safety of a private passenger on a Virgin Galactic plane is way less than a NASA astronaut going on the next SpaceX vehicle. If Australia had that kind of buyer beware view as well, then I think it would be easily transferable. But if Australia tried to put NASA-type human safety regulations around the activity, that would make it really, really expensive to do.
That's actually worth thinking about quite a lot when you actually stand back for that for 1 minute, and you actually think the people who are prepared to take the risk are the ones who get the most regulatory protection anyway. So, Adam, you know, Blake, you guys, you're actually designing and building rockets. How do your activities actually grow other sectors of the space economy in Australia? How are they going to boost other parts for this economy? And perhaps also, how are they going to inspire the population?
Okay, so we currently have about 300 different suppliers of things to our company already. You know, we're developing an orbital vehicle. I'm going to guess it has like 2,000 or 3,000 different parts. You know, we may manufacture half of those, so 1,500 of them we have to outsource. So right now we're in a process of looking for partners in Australia and outside Australia. Good news is we're finding a lot of partners in Australia. So that's like a direct benefit of getting the business done elsewhere. We're also finding companies that make things for adjacent industries that we say, hey, you could use that process or machine to make something for us. So that's like value adding for their business as well. I think a great thing about space technology is it is really, really hard. And you know, the engineers that come into these companies are solving very, very complex problems. And as they move in and out of the industry and go into other industries, they take that complex problem-solving attitude with them. And you know, one of the things that we've started hiring people from other rocket companies, and you know, the ones that have made it to space have this fantastic attitude that nothing is too hard. And so that is a fantastic attitude to have. You know, if you go out of the industry and you're working on a really hard problem in flying vehicles or whatever it is, you know, you have the skill set to do a great job with that. And that's some of the power, I think, that the United States has, that they have this massive rocket program and these engineers go in and out of the industry and they make all the other industries good. And I think Australia could get to that point too. And then you've got, you know, the inspiration of, you know, why do people go into STEM? You know, I think, working for a rocket company is high on the list of a lot of people that do STEM. It is, I can assure you, unreal fun to work in a rocket and to test a rocket engine. I've been a banker for 20 years, and my best day in banking is nothing like doing something with a rocket. So it's a good industry to go into. You're learning complex things. You have a great sense of achievement. So I think it's a really, really good thing to have.
So not being a banker, off topic, I'd really like to know what your best day in banking would look like, but another time. Much like Adam said, there is the supply chain of outsourced items. You got to understand what your capabilities are and how much you can push these things. And when you go beyond that, you're either going to do something silly or find someone else that can actually do it. And fortunately, Australian ingenuity, we have a lot of really, really good resources, whether it be in machinery or people skills. And a lot of people, because the space sort of side is not that huge in Australia yet, a lot of people aren't aware that their skill sets can be applied directly to the space industry. So it's exciting to learn and see those people as they evolve. In addition with a lot of the testing and that we're doing, it's the age-old question for space. So much technology that we have today is because of space. So people that have had braces, people that, power drills and things like that, these are all because of space activities. So it's a continual evolution. So how does it help people, companies and that in the future? It's going to be a remaining story about there's lots of technology that hasn't even been discovered yet, and they're going to create industries in their own right, I believe, over time as we mature technology, as whether it's launch sites or launch capabilities. And things are getting smaller, things are getting faster, things are getting more efficient. So you just look at the networks that are evolving these days. There's a constant thrive to better themselves. So it's a very wide sort of question as to what other industries do we help by doing this. It's almost limitless.
So in the defence world that I've got a background in, we talk a lot about what a sovereign industrial capability is and what it means, and one day somebody will work that out. But why Australia? What are the benefits, of not only manufacturing our own satellites, operating our own satellites? What benefits can you see by being able to launch our own satellites from Australia?
I think one of the issues, like space is now a fighting domain, and you think about, okay, you're going to go into an early stage of a war with a major power. They're going to take out your satellites. It's not unreasonable to think they're going to send a couple of missiles to take out your launch sites as well. So you look at our major defence partner, the United States. They've probably got about 5 or 6 launch sites to reconstitute all of their space assets. And if even 3 of them go down, even if none of them go down, they're going to have a real struggle to put up hundreds of satellites in a hurry. So it's really good for us to be able to do that from Australia, not only to play our part in the allied protection, but also to look after ourselves, because it's not unreasonable to think in that situation we're not going to be the first country that's going to get protected as all these assets get reconstituted. And I think that is something that you cannot brush under the cover, that you have to prepare for, especially when capability is coming.
Which that opens up a more interesting, an interesting topic as well, which is probably not for this panel, but is actually how many LEO orbits are there really available, and the congestion, and if we ever start, God forbid, having satellites destroyed, the chaos that's going to cause in space. So how do we get, what are the general population, what are they going to be able to see when you guys start launching? I mean, some of you are launching already. And how are they going to get to see it?
first thing they'll see is just pure awesomeness. What else do you want?
Now, I think it's a good point. I mean, we also talk to the tourism ministers about our business as well. You know, there's some of the launches out at Cape Canaveral get like 100,000 people go to see the launch. So I don't think it's unreasonable that on some of the launches we do from here, there'll be 10,000 people go and see the launch. So I think that's a big deal. And the good thing about a rocket launch is you can see it from a really long way away. So you can literally be 100 kilometers away in a clear sky and see the rocket, high up in the sky. So it's something that, you'll be able to see it from Adelaide, I would say, if you are launching from Whalers Way as it goes up into the upper atmosphere. So it is something that Australians going to, almost one of these days they'll take it for granted, but it's going to be cool.
And, whoosh, not bang. So hopefully, it's I'll call it less observable than a bang. But, when Elon Musk launched his Falcon Heavy, it was actually 500,000 people turned up to watch. That's almost half of Adelaide turning up to watch a rocket launch. So from a STEM engagement perspective, it's fantastic. I look forward to the space agency putting forward a video that doesn't start with the Saturn V, but starts off with one of the potential manufacturers that we have either in country who want to come to our country, and that really will inspire people and drive that next level of engagement.
We've been getting, since a really early stage, people emailing and saying, hey, how can I get to East Arnhem Land to have a look at your launch, and can I do that next week, or when's the next one coming up? So there's this sort of latent interest in launch that's just ready to go, not just throughout Australia, but also internationally. When we talk to the traditional owners and the local community in East Arnhem Land, one of the things around tourism is actually how to manage it really well and sensitively into the region. Because, I've seen a resupply mission, you're right, people are lining the streets for kilometres around. And all of the locations in Australia that are planned for launch, they have a remoteness to them which makes them safe, but they're all accessible. And so we're expecting to see that people will turn up to these launches however they can get there to get a viewing spot somewhere nearby. But also there's an opportunity to then stream what's happening in Australia. And so, your grandma sitting at home is able to look at it as well, or whatever it might be. And I think it's a really exciting opportunity for physical-based tourism, both during the launch and subsequently to see what that facility is about. But also just expanding the understanding of what Australia's about through the online communications that will take place as well.
With the tourism side, it's the spin-off as well for all the people needing accommodation, and you'll see all the spin-offs. Like even now, Lot 14 talking about the what they call it, the new space centre, the Space Discovery Centre. Yeah. So those things alone are going to be huge, and I look forward to, we won't physically necessarily have someone in the mission control, but we look forward to streaming our launches to mission control. So people that aren't even at the launches will be able to view live what's going on, see live data coming in, and that's, it's just something about it good to feed off. And fortunately for me, my next rocket I get to see is on Friday.
Friday, did you say?
Yeah, we got the UK launch going on Friday now because of the rain out last week.
Where's that being launched from, as a matter of interest?
You know the saying, if I tell you. It's up in Queensland, but yeah.
So the next question, I think perhaps there's a question here that a few people want a bit of education about, is, well, what's the difference between a launch site you need for a LEO, a MEO, a GEO? In fact, maybe what even LEO, MEO and GEO quickly mean. Do a bit of quick education.
Yep. So LEO, the difference, there's a bit of a split opinion to what LEO and MEO, where that starts, but roughly low Earth orbit goes up to about 1,500 kilometres to 2,000 kilometres. Medium Earth orbit is anywhere from there to, say, 10,000 kilometres. And then geostationary orbit is around 35,000-ish kilometres up. And that's a particular point where the orbital speed matches the orbital rotation of the Earth. So the satellite is, from a ground observer, stationary, So that's a very popular site to be in. There's no difference from the launch site. So the launch site, you can launch to GEO from the same launch site you launch to LEO. But generally, when you want to go to GEO, you want to be as close as you can to the equator. But SpaceX goes to GEO from Cape Canaveral. So you can still go to GEO from lower latitudes. But yeah, use the same launch site.
And to add to that, that's where what ELA and Southern Launch are doing are so very complementary, right? That ELA up right near the equator is perfectly located to get into those more equatorial plains. And from our Whalers Way location, we're primarily focused on inclinations from 60 degrees all the way through to retrograde. And it shows how Australia can potentially satisfy both market requirements as the industry grows and as the demand starts to mature across the world. So for awareness, geostationary satellites is a lot of our telecommunications, NBN and the likes, but there are smaller satellites going into those equatorial orbits. And then a lot of our Earth observation satellites are going into your orbits around the poles, for example. So they service different options or different needs, but ultimately it all benefits Australians as we walk around looking at Google Maps and the likes. That's where all of that data comes from, all of those different satellites doing different operations in orbit. So, yeah.
I think one of the other things around launch sites themselves, those points are perfect, and I could have just left it at that. But one of the things that we're finding interesting as a launch site that is developing is that we're looking at, suborbital vehicles, micro, small, medium, heavy lift. How does that progress as a discussion in Australia? And the infrastructure requirements around that. So when we're planning out our site, we're looking at, well, what do we physically need to build to have those different vehicles on site? And it's a really exciting time because there are, we always talk about 130 odd vehicles in production or being attempted. There are so many people that are attempting vehicle technology. Obviously, these are some of the leading groups here. But it is a discussion then for Australia to say, well, what types of vehicles will we host in Australia? And then what sort of infrastructure will we need to give those vehicles their best chance at doing, whether it's LEO, GEO, whatever it might be. And so it's a really exciting and interesting discussion for our engineers as well to start planning those fuels and how we do everything really efficiently from Australia. So there's a very practical component to it for a site as well.
And if I can add to that as well, that when there's this whole concept of old space versus new space, and for us in Southern Launch, we focus primarily on the new space. So if you want a good example of what a very small rocket launch or rocket looks like, Perigi Aerospace are in the hall next door with their, I think it's 8.7 meter long rocket. Now, for some, we've been told that is still a big rocket, but in the scheme of things, that's a small rocket, and that means that the infrastructure required to launch a rocket that size is very small. And from a safety perspective, it then means that we as Australia can learn how to do safe rocket launches with small rockets and progress forward from there and understand the risks and over time shape the way we approach regulations and exclusion zones and interacting with all the different government bodies who are involved in the complexity of a rocket launch. So it's very exciting as we see, as Carley points out, these different sizes of rockets coming along and doing all these different operations in space.
So that, to me, sounds like we need a kind of a Pathfinder mission. What should we be doing? How do we create this national Pathfinder mission? What could it be? What could it look like? And perhaps when could we have it?
Okay, I have a strong view on this. I think we should do something around the moon. I think going to the surface of the moon might be tricky, but it's doable. But definitely going around the moon, I think it'll be fantastic for anybody in Australia to look up at the moon and think there's something Australian either on the surface or going around. You see it almost every night. I think that'll be fantastic. And it is definitely achievable. I think anywhere in the next 5 to 7 years we could do something like that.
So we were having a bit of a discussion about this the panel, and there's talk about putting something on the moon and maybe some green and gold, like a glitter bomb or something. Don't know how practical that is, but obviously, you know, ambitious projects are what inspire us. You know, why did man climb Mount Everest? Because why not? Taking a step back, though, leading up smaller projects where there is the collaboration between launch providers, launch sites, payload providers, whatever that may include, finding a mission within a short period of time, a couple of years, could be a fantastic you know, program to run that would see many of the existing companies and future startups getting involved. It's almost like our own mini Moon to Mars Artemis program, but yeah, it's something like that as a small scale. It's probably very realistic in the early stages for small scales, and then as it grows, moving into things with moon missions and the likes.
It's really interesting that, you know, I don't believe Australia, our space industry is not big enough to do our own, you know, put a person on the moon. But we're starting to see some not so insignificant investment in space, be it the SmartSat CRC or the Artemis program. And you start to dream about, well, can we take what's being developed in some of those programs and give them just a little bit more legs and take them from a LEO orbit to a cislunar orbit, or, you know, and quite easily, in an orbital mechanics way, we could start to demonstrate some of the say, SmartSat CRC technologies around the moon. And that would ultimately reduce the cost of doing some of these very, very ambitious or very inspiring projects by doing that leverage.
I won't try to out-vision Adam. I think that that concept of being able to look up to the moon and knowing that there's something about Australian enterprise that's associated with the moon is just a really beautiful kind of vision. And whether we're going for a smaller scale version or something of that nature, what we're hearing through the panel is that Australia's space industry, in a commercial sense, is really coming along in leaps and bounds, and all of these things are very practical and very possible now. So when we're talking to the Space Agency or federal government, for example, and they'll come back to us in great consultation and say, how can we inspire people around space? What can we do about that? And how can we grow industry? And the fact is that launch is just such a tremendous opportunity to do that and to tie all those other bits and pieces together. So you get a launch happening, it goes to the moon or somewhere more nearby, and you've got people going to the site. You've got engineers involved in building the site and the infrastructure to get you going. You've got a whole string of industry that is thriving because of something that is very visual and very inspiring and very achievable. And so what we're calling for now is to say, well, launch and Australian industry is ripe for investment, both by governments here and abroad, by industry here and abroad. Now is the time for launch. Hurrah.
So on that hurrah point, which is absolutely tremendous, and I'll just make a comment, I think there's another reason this national mission is so important, is to keep it on the front, keep this industry on the front page of the newspapers, because we will very quickly run out of things to talk about if we don't have that national mission. And we all know why the front page of the newspaper is important. So, and somebody suggests that we call it Koala on the Moon. I want to finish, we have 7 minutes left, so a kind of final question for you all, which you weren't expecting. And hopefully you'll give a different answer for each one. What is the one thing that you would wish would happen to boost your business? And we know it's about investment, so what is the one thing that you guys would like to happen that would unlock that investment pipeline for you? Yeah. Okay, let me change it. One realistic
No, you
thing.
could say, this would be a lot harder if you said you can't say money.
Yeah.
So I will wish for a very smooth development path on the way to orbit, because I'm certainly assuming we're going to have quite a few hiccups.
If we step aside from the answer that we all want to give around investment and regulation support, one of the things that I think is really important as a nation that we talk to is around our appetite for risk. Now, we've talked about the fact that we are involved in some, I mean, you know, you look at SpaceX and they say if we're not breaking something or having some sort of mishap, then we're not pushing hard enough. We're not pushing our technologies and our efforts hard enough. And I think it's a very different scenario in Australia, where it is a case often when I have conversations that people will say essentially, you're telling me there's either zero risk and I'm happy with that, or 100% failure and massive disaster. And there's nothing in between. Now, we need to be in a space as a nation that we have an in-between, and we back each other in that to say, well, did you have the right process in place to deal with something that happened, and how did you recover from that? So I think that risk appetite would be a great thing.
I knew I should have spoken before you, Carley. So if risk's off the table, it's a combination of all of these things where it's a smooth path, yes, for actual vehicle development and the likes, but smooth path from the regulatory side of things, so that, again, back on that educational path where, yes, about risk, we need to understand it and appreciate it and understand that the risk is there, but the profiles are there to also protect everything. But just having an easy channel to be able to achieve these things. So when we're talking about internationals coming in, we don't need the regulatory burdens, and not talking about Australia, we're talking about international as well. So, you know, I reflect on our own customer. They had their crate held up by UK Border Force for 3 weeks, simply because someone saw this and thought this was a missile. It's like no relation at all. So having those abilities to easily and transformatively communicate will help streamline things, and that will just make everyone's life easier.
So I'm actually going to go on the softer side of things, and I'm going to say that what I think we all really want is support from the Australian people, because what we're trying to do hasn't been done for almost 50 years. And, you know, the processes, the procedures, everything we're going through is difficult. It's really, really difficult. And knowing that we have the support of the Australian people behind us in what we're trying to achieve really makes the time spent in the offices away from family, all of that really worthwhile, because, you know, we're not just doing it for ourselves. So please support us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, panel. Been tremendous. So I think in summary, what I'm hearing is that we have a great opportunity here to get the regulatory environment right, and to do that, we really need to sort of revisit what the risk appetite should be. We need to think about how we make sure the process is speedy to get inside the approval times of other nations. I'm also hearing that if we manufactured everything in Australia, we wouldn't need to cross borders, and so we wouldn't have Lloyd's problems. But also the importance of inspiration, not only for young people, but also for the nation as a whole, to understand that Australia is capable of these sorts of things. We've done it before and we can do it again. So thank you very much.
Wow, amazing. Now we are at the end of this intensive day. We started this morning, 6 o'clock, and I think it's a very interesting day, and I just have a couple considerations, but two words come in my mind now is collaboration and integration. So this morning with the Prime Minister and the Premier, we understand that thanks to the collaboration amongst federal government, state government, and the community, academia, research organizations, industry, we are able to support the growing of the space industry. So collaboration is an important value, for us to growing this industry. At the same time, we talk about R&D and with Smart CRC, and also in this case, collaboration, and in particular the integration of some initiative. We talk about R&D that have to addresses to some needs from the end user. And then, Crystal start to think about, in which way we can prioritize the R&D, in particular if the resources are not what we want. And then, of course, we start to think about, in particular, the Smart CRC, about some high impact area where R&D is important now. Disaster management, monitoring, water monitoring, and national security. But also in this case, we understood that the integration of some activity like education and support the growing of space industry and then startup and etc. are very important. So R&D is a very complex aspect. We need to consider all of these areas. And when we talk about education, was more or less the same, integration and collaboration. Story and people inspire the young student. So what does mean this? It means a new narrative, as Lisa said this afternoon. So not only school, best practice, Hamilton and secondary college and the VSEC, but also support the museum, but also be involved in many workshops, seminars, invite young kids and also students to be involved in this activity. But also experience like what we did at the beginning of this year is the working experience. So integration and collaboration is come back here again. And the last panel is quite important. We decide to include it in the forum today because it's very important. It's a time to open the discussion about this activity. Access to the space is not just something that is related to economic aspect and jobs, but is inspired, as we talked before. And also is something that is really important to have as a nation, have access to the space from ourselves, sovereignty capability. So there are some aspects that are important to start to discuss. And what the community wants in this particular moment is just mitigate the risk. So, the conference today and the panel this afternoon was just to talk and try to understand in which way we can mitigate the risk. So I think that we are at the conclusion now, and I would like to just thank you all to be here, for one day, full day with us. And let me thank one more time the sponsor, the MDA Foundation, the Australian Space Agency, the Smart CRC, Boeing, CSIRO, the Space Industry Association of Australia, iNew in Space, Electro-Optic System, MDI. But let me thank the team of Defense SA and SASIC that, believe me, they worked for a couple months for this event, and we already start to work for the next event that will be in December. And I would like to highlight how it's important to have a team like this. Then we start from the CEO, Richard Price, then Lucinda, Carol, Madison, Caroline, Laura, Rita, Maurice that work in the reception, and in the stand, on the stand, and among the people in terms of networking, Daring, Lorna, Reg, Suman, Emily. Just two people that is very, very close to us, to me, and that is my CEO, Richard Price, and Nikki Salerno. Without these two people, really was a big challenge, but they make the life very easy. Thank you very much, and see you in December.